everybody, I'm Pastor AJ Houseman, and welcome to 10-Foot Pole, a podcast dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it.
Sorry. I mean, did you just want to start?
No.
You want to go? Okay.
No.
Okay. Go. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 24. Today our guest is Rabbi Evan Ravski, who is the rabbi of Synagogue Emmanuel in Charleston, South Carolina. And I'm very excited. And also that, we're just having such a great conversation that we've been here talking for forever. And I was like, maybe we should actually start recording some of this because this is just absolutely fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on, Pastor.
Thank you for joining me. This is very exciting. So Rabbi is actually lives across the street from Pastor Eric, who's the other pastor at St. Matthew's with me. And so I met Rabbi over some cocktails one night at Pastor Eric's house and was like, this is the guy. We got to figure out, we're going to get him on the podcast to talk about some fun things. And so when this particular lesson popped up in our lectionary, I was like, oh, I know exactly who I want to talk about this. So this is really, really great. So thank you for joining us for this conversation.
My pleasure. It's great to be here. Looking forward to it. Like you said, the conversation we've already been having has just been fantastic, and we'll get into it, and we'll see where it takes us.
So today we're going to talk about Genesis chapter 3, verses 8 to 15, which is the first lesson for Sunday, June 9th, if you are going to a church that follows the lectionary. So I don't know if you know this, but there's the Revised Common Lectionary is what it's called, and so
I'm unfamiliar with it.
Mainline denominations, Lutheran, Episcopalian, Catholic, Methodist, whatever, all your normal denominations is what I call them, follow the same set of readings. So every week there is a first reading, which is typically from the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, and then there's a psalm. And then there is a second lesson, which is typically a New Testament reading in one of the epistles. And then there's a gospel lesson.
Okay.
And so every single week, all those churches all around the world are reading the exact same things, which is kind of cool. So one of the commentaries or ideas for sermons that I usually look up is from the Church of Scotland, because I love their stuff. And they have the same thing, right? So it doesn't matter where in the world you're at. If you're part of one of these sort of mainline denominations, they're all reading the same things.
Yeah, we have the same thing in Judaism, except what we do is we take the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and we divide the entire thing up into 54 different, we call them in Hebrew parshiot, which is a section, right? Episodes, if you will, and every week we read one more. We read the next parsha. So we start Genesis 1:1. We make our way all the way through Deuteronomy 34, and we do that over the course of a single year.
And you read them in order.
Read them in order. Nice. All the way through. Occasionally we have to double up because, like I said, there's 54 divisions, but only 52 weeks, and then there's holidays in there where you don't read the normal thing. So sometimes we double up, but similar wherever I go in the world, it tends to be the same section of the Torah that we're reading.
Yeah, I like that. I also that it's in order. That's a thing that I struggle with, which the audience, if they've been with me since the beginning, they know I'm not a fan of the Revised Common Lectionary, but I also don't have a better system. Because it's sporadic. And so the readings each week sort of has to do with the thematic part of the gospel lesson. And then the readings are someone's interpretation of places in our Old and New Testament that have something to do with that particular gospel lesson. Right. And so sometimes you can see the clear theme. Sometimes you can see why they picked it. And sometimes I'm like, you're just making things up and calling it, good biblical stuff. And so I struggle with that a little bit in my own understanding.
Well, so this is now totally off topic for what we're here for today, but just in looking at the commonalities between the two religions. So what our, in your terms, second lesson would be is after we read this section of Torah that we're reading every week, we then read what's called a Haftorah, and it's actually a selection from the book of prophets. And the way that came around was that in ancient times, when the Jewish people or the Israelite people were being persecuted, the first place that the government would start with persecution was ban the study of Torah. You're not allowed, right? If you disconnect a people from their most sacred religious text, it's the easiest way to try and destroy a religion. And so what the rabbis did was they went into the prophets and they found sections that they felt were thematically connected to what we were supposed to be reading that week from the Torah, and instead we read that section. And then nowadays we just kept both of them in. We didn't want to ever get rid of one of them.
Sure.
So we just read both back to back now. So also just
That's
that
great.
thematic
So
connection. It's right.
So in our lesson for today out of Genesis, so there's in here. So depending if I assume maybe some folks from Emmanuel will listen to this if you're on
Absolutely. We're advertising this. It's
oh,
great.
That's sweet. That a difference that we have in our different ways of how we refer to God is so. Here, this is a part where instead of Elohim, it is indeed the tetragrammaton of God's name, the four-letter name of God that we don't say. And so how that gets notated is a little different. So in the Christian Bible, the version that I sent you, it's a capital L-O-R-D, Lord. Anywhere you see a capital, like all caps Lord, that's what that is replacing. Whereas in, I also have I think I just have the Jewish English Bible, the complete Jewish Bible. That's the other translation that I found, which is almost exactly the same, except for where we would have L-O-R-D is a capital, in all caps, Adonai.
Fascinating. So you'll share the translation. So I'm I'm a rabbi in the conservative movement, right? We have 3 different mainline denominations.
You should maybe explain that a little bit too.
Sure.
If that's okay with you.
Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. Orthodox is on what we would call like the right of the denominational spectrum. Reform is on the left. Conservative occupies somewhere in between those two. The name conservative, although now carries all these political connotations, really comes from this idea that we're trying to conserve tradition while also recognize evolution and in the modern world, right? That we can update our understanding of the world tied to tradition, but also that the world today looks very different from this ancient world of the Israelites in the Bible, and finding a way to keep one foot in both worlds to find balance between the two. So the 3 mainline denominations, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. I'm looking at the conservative translation of it, and it just uses Lord and God, capital L, but a capital L-O-R-D, actually.
Oh, yours has it too. It doesn't say
Adonai. It does. No, it doesn't. But here, because it's really Adonai Elohim here in these chapters, and so it uses Lord God. Sorry, I'm just opening up chapter 3 and looking at it. So where it uses Elohim, it does use.
It uses both.
Uses both.
Okay.
Adonai Elohim is Lord God, and then Elohim is actually translating just as God. Any which way.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to point that out a little bit, but so something too to say about sort of, we were kind of talking about, sort of the different denominations of both Judaism and Christianity, and like how, kind of across the spectrum it could be. And so that's something that I appreciate in our conversation of also understanding that, like, I think sometimes when Christians, like, they're like, oh, Judaism, like it's one thing, and you're like, but it's not, right? And so like all over the spectrum of like, I think sometimes like the real traditional, like, would be Orthodox people that like maybe is going through the mind, right, with the curly cues in front of the ears and the.
So that's even further to the right.
Wow!
The curly cues and the side locks is even further to the right of Orthodox. It's more of the ultra-Orthodox world. And there's even to the left of Reform. But, the mainline denominations are those 3.
And maybe the mainline we'd see in the United States is more saying anything, or just globally?
Yeah, the only place you'll see like the Jews walking around with like the big fur hats or the long black coats or the side locks like that.
Queens.
Right. Brooklyn, right? You'll see it in like the larger cities where they have those massive populations of Jews. But for the most part, when you're talking Orthodox, conservative, or Reform, we don't have the side locks. I happen to have a beard, but that's just because
it works for you.
It works for me. Yeah, exactly. But many Orthodox and of all denomination are clean shaven.
Yeah, and women can be conservative rabbis.
Correct. The conservative and Reform movements are egalitarian, so women can hold all
the
positions.
Same offices, everything's okay.
Correct. Yep. Orthodox is still non-egalitarian. It will always be non-egalitarian, meaning that the religion is led by men. Men and women sit separately during services, and it's only men leading. Women don't have the same religious voice as men do.
Yeah. I did my clinical pastoral education. One of the guys in my group was an Orthodox rabbi. And we literally, were never allowed to, stand next to each other, and we were, praying or things like that, because he was not allowed to touch me.
Right. Right. There's no touching between men and women, between the genders.
And, it wasn't, weird for me, and it wasn't weird for him. It was just fine. It was what it was, right? And I can respect that. But our CPE advisor, really, had a problem with it, and, challenging, it was somehow disrespecting me that he was acting that way. And I was like, it's fine, dude. We can get along and respect each other, and that's what really counts, to me anyways.
Right, and they're supposed to be respectful. If you extend your hand to them, they are supposed to, either shake your hand back or say something respectful that lets you know that they're not going to shake your hand. Hugging is something different, but we're supposed to be polite in the way we approach people.
In general, that's how I like to think that, just in general, that's how humans should act. But that's just to me. But,
I would agree. I would agree.
Okay, diving into the actual some Bible stuff here. But one more just disclaimer. I think I've talked about this before, but sort of the understanding and breakdown of obviously how the Christian Bible is set up is we have the Old Testament and the New Testament, and we have the Gospels are the beginning of our New Testament, right? It starts with Jesus, and then we have all the letters. There's also a part of in the Bible in there which we call the Apocrypha. In the Catholic Bible, that's just a part of their Bible. In the Protestant traditions, we don't have it. We consider those outside of the canon. And the main reason for that is because they're not included in the Hebrew Bible canon. So things like Sirach and some other things, all the Maccabees. Yep, all of those. So those are within the Catholic Bible, but they're not within the Protestant canon, if that makes sense. And so then the Hebrew Bible is broken down to, so you have the Torah, which are the 5 books of Moses, and then you have the prophets, and then the wisdom, writings. Yeah. I was like Tanakh, and I was trying to put that all together.
Good Hebrew.
That's what it's called. And that's a little acronym for each piece, right?
Correct.
Torah, Nehavim, and then Ketuvim.
Correct.
Yeah. Look,
yes.
I'm not terrible.
You're great. You're great. That's great.
Things, yeah. Which actually sometimes feels affirming that I was like, oh, I have been taught these things correctly. So.
Well, you got the ch in Tanakh, so that's the,
I did take Hebrew in seminary. Don't hand me that because I can't read it. I felt really good when I got to a point where I knew if my flashcards were upside down. I was like, oh, that's
an accomplishment. And just to note, when we say Old Testament versus Hebrew Bible, we are, even though it's the same books, we are talking there in a little bit of a different order.
Yes, they are.
So, for instance, I know Ruth is at the start. It comes before the book of Judges or before the book of Samuel.
Yeah.
For in the Christian Bible. In the Jewish Bible, the book of Ruth comes in the writings. It's way at the end. It's lower on the hierarchy. We go Judges, Samuel, Kings. 1 and 2, obviously, for both of those are in there. But it's not a chronological sense. It's sort of a hierarchy theologically ordered.
Trying to figure out where's it at. I think it's different on different things.
For us, it's in Ketuvim. It's way at the end. It's in the.
I have 2 pages that are actually from the same website up, and one of them's the the Genesis text that I have up in the Complete Jewish Bible, and it had them in that order. Like Ruth was way down, and I was like, "What? I think you're right. It is up here." And as soon as I switched tabs, and right now I have Roman open because that has something to do with what we're going to talk about in a Christian perspective. It's Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel, and Kings and Chronicles, and.
Right, so it's just a little bit of a different order.
Yeah.
So, the subtleness of the Old Testament versus the Hebrew Bible.
And to be honest with you, I have no idea why they're ordered the way that they're ordered, other than they might consider it like a historical.
Right, well, because that's
what happens like next in timeline.
Right, for Christianity, Ruth is really important because it's the start of David, right? Ruth is David's grandmother, and you need David because then you're going to have Mary and Joseph and Jesus later on that need to be in David's line. And so that it becomes much more important for Christianity than it does for Judaism, where we look at Ruth and we say it's a really nice story about the holiday of Shavuot, which is like the Jewish Pentecost, which is coming up in a couple weeks. But that's
I was gonna say,
it's like much
really
later
soon
on.
We're gonna go through like all of Ruth and eat some ice cream.
Exactly.
So
you're gonna come to the synagogue and teach. We're looking
I'm
forward
very excited. I'll bring my energy drinks. I don't know about staying up all night, but we'll do what we can. Here we go. Yeah, so anyways, never mind. I was going to go down a tangent, and we don't need to talk about it, because you made a comment that, like, David's not as important, and so, like...
No, David is important. The line of David... Like, David is important. He's the king of Israel. He, creates the kingdom of Israel, but... It's
you
not.
Guys don't care what happens after that,
right? I mean, you need Solomon. You need Solomon. He builds the temple, the first temple. Yeah, so that's really important. Mm-hmm. And it's really Solomon's kids once he dies that are they can't get along and they fight.
The rest of David's kids are kind of not awesome either.
They are not awesome either. But it's Solomon's kids that once they start dividing up the kingdom and create all this problem. But the ancestry of David is not as important. That's what I'll say. Yes. The ancestry of David is not as important for us theologically as it is for Christianity.
I mean, that does make sense, yeah. Okay. All right. So we're going to dive into Genesis chapter 3, verses 8 to 15. And I'm going to read the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. They heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" He said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself." God said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" The man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit from the tree, and I ate." Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" The woman said, "The serpent tricked me, and I ate." The Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals, and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and the dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will strike your heel, and you will he will strike your head, and you will strike his heel."
That's a good translation, like I said. It's very close to the Jewish translation that I'm looking at.
Well, that's good. That also does make me feel better about our translations as well. I also, again, the audience already knows this, at least that has been with me for a while, that I care very deeply about the translations of the Bible, and that's one of the things that gets on me when sometimes people are quoting and I know the translations and I'm like, that's not don't go there. Anyways, so this is sort of the second part of this longer story of Genesis 3, where they get put in the garden or paradise, depending on the language. And also in this garden is this tree that gives you the knowledge of good and evil, right? And so then there's a serpent in the garden and is like, "Hey, Eve, you should eat this fruit." And she's like, "No, God said we can't." And he was like, "He doesn't really mean that. You can totally eat it." And then we get this part. Because they both eat of this fruit, and their eyes are opened.
Not an apple.
Not an apple, right? Apple. This is the... whatever the sacred fruit is here.
An etrog. Judaism says either a pomegranate or an etrog, which is like a citron that we use in one of our holidays in the fall.
Oh.
It's like a fancy lemon.
I mean, are those more just like maybe authentic to the area?
Right. So that's why we know it's not an apple, right? Is that
yeah.
apples don't exist in that area. But the idea is that there's a reference to the tree as like a good-looking tree, right? When Eve is looking at it, or the woman, right? We haven't given her that name yet.
Yeah.
But when the woman is looking at the tree, she notices the beauty of the tree. And biblically as well, the etrog, this citron that we use, it comes from pre-Eitz Hadar, which is it's the fruit of the beautiful tree. And so the rabbis and the scholars look and they say, well, this tree is called the beautiful tree, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil is called a beautiful tree, and therefore it must be the same tree because they're both called the same thing.
I mean, that logic reasons with me, so that's fine. So you brought up something to kind of talk about here, this idea that like it's not until Genesis 4 that they're given like proper names, right? So it's still so a man and his wife, is that Adam and Ishash, or is it you're looking at the Hebrew, is that Ish and Ishash?
It is Ish and Isha.
Okay.
Wait,
that's what I was trying to say.
Let me double check.
In verse 8, right? That this, or I guess the beginning of the whole story.
No, it's Ha'adam, actually. In verse 8, it's Ha'adam ve'ishto.
Okay.
It's, yeah, so it's, you can edit this, just change it, yeah.
That's okay, I usually do. I always take out, like, weird gaps, too, anyway, so.
So in the Hebrew, even in verse 8, it's Ha'adam ve'ishto. Adam, and
human,
his wife,
a man,
right, a man, a human, right. Yes. It comes from because Adam, right, this first person was created from the earth, right, from the dust of the earth. In Hebrew, the word for dust of the earth is Adama, which is just a
I always
conjugation
call
of the word.
I always call him the dirtling. That's what I say.
Right, the dirtling. I like it. I like it.
Yes.
Right, so
it's the first dirtling.
But so it's the same root word, right? Adam and Adama. So he's known as Adam, and then we just Englishicize it. Anglicize it.
Anglicize? Is that right? I'm not sure.
Who knows?
Okay, I know what you mean.
And we make Adam.
Yeah.
So, that's where we get Ishto, the Isha, the woman, doesn't get her name until chapter 4 when we get Eve, Chava.
Where does that name come from?
No idea. In all honesty,
chapter. Looking
at chapter 4, V'Hadam yada et Chava Ishto, and man knew Eve, his wife. That's it. There's no explanation for her name, which is a little bit odd because normally we get explanations of the origins of their names because the names are significant to where they come from or who will come from them.
That does make sense. And so this was the one we don't know.
We just
don't
know.
Appears, and that's where her name is now.
Right.
All right. So this story is probably in Christianity is the most famous and most well-known story in the entire Hebrew Bible.
Wow.
For reasons that we talked about before we started, right? But what this means and how it's been interpreted in Christian theology about this concept of the fall or original sin. Can you share with us a little bit about like what this story kind of like where it sits in your theology and where and what, because I know it doesn't have the same like.
I was gonna say I'm gonna feel really bad here because I'm gonna say not so much theological weight.
Yeah.
Right?
No, tell us about it because I think that's really important, and there's more like modern Christian scholars that are trying to kind of like maybe reframe that a little bit, and that maybe Augustine was just an asshole and we shouldn't listen to everything he said. But that's just my personal opinion.
Well, so again, and I'm speaking from my denominational point, right? Not from an Orthodox, from those to the right to me. They might say that, yes, this is the literal word of God. This is exactly how it happened. for my theology, I look at these opening stories of Genesis, and I see it as humanity's attempt to understand the origins of the world around them, right? They didn't know about evolution. They didn't know about, the Big Bang or any of those other scientific concepts that help us explain where the world or the universe came from.
So when people were asking, like, where did we come from or whatever, these were their stories.
Right. They're asking them 5,000 years ago, right? And so you're getting different myths, right, that people need to make sense of. And then when you have the development of the ancient Israelite cult, which eventually becomes Judaism, you've got all these different tribes and their stories and their foundational understandings of where do we come from and what do you do with them. And so I think Judaism and the Bible tries to take these origin stories and bring them together. That's why we see Genesis 1 and 2 looking very different from each other in how the world was created, right? Was it 7 days where humanity was created last, or is it a different order of creation in Genesis 2 where humanity is created first and then placed in the garden and the garden's created around them? And so when you get to a story like this, the Garden of Eden, it's really looking at the origin of, like, where did good and evil come from, right? Like, why do we know the difference? Why do we have morality and ethics in this world? It's coming from this story. And why don't we live in paradise? Why
is the world the way it is?
Why is the world the way it is, right? Why do we have to farm to get crops from the ground? Why do snakes bite us? Those sort of questions. I think that's, for me, theologically, that's really what those opening chapters of Genesis are trying to answer, is humanity's struggle with, or questioning of, where do we come from? How did we get here?
Yeah. And that's something we've talked about on the podcast before, about sort of understanding and dating things, right? And it's not that we can come up with an exact date of, when these stories in Genesis are sort of compiled, but the idea that, like, they are sort of looking back, right? That they're not necessarily kind of meant to be taken as a literal, this is the exact order in which things happened.
No, if I was taking it literally, I could tell you that this story happened 5,784 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Because that's what year it is in the Jewish calendar right now, 5784. and if I were taking that literal stance, that would mean that the entire world is 5,784 years old. And everything that's happened in this world has happened within that time. I like to think of it as that is our understanding of, like, known history, recorded history is that long, and it starts here.
Well, but, like, other cultures have recorded history much longer than that.
Yeah, but for Judaism, right? Yeah. For the Jewish perspective of things, that's where it starts. I know that the world is in fact billions of years old, right? I don't deny that, but I also recognize that, like, my religious history goes back those 5,000 plus years.
Yeah. But also the understanding too of, like, having these different stories that are put together, as we talked about the different creation stories. Right. And my favorite, as I said, is the flood story, right? And, like, how many animals did Moses take, right? Like, it depends on which paragraph. Whoever was taking animals on the boat. Thank you, Rabbi, for that correction.
Moses took no animals. I am 100% sure.
Thank you. That those stories are kind of intermixed in that way. But
right, and we definitely, in Judaism, we recognize that there are parts of the Bible that are older than others, right? If we look at, like, the Hebrew and the grammar and all that, we know that the Song of the Sea, Exodus chapter 15, is older Hebrew than most of the rest of the Torah. So if we're looking at, like, what was written first, that's one of those really older sections. Where Genesis places in that. You had mentioned that one of your professors talked about how because Adam and Eve and Noah and others aren't referenced later on, that it could indicate that it is a newer, quote unquote, a newer part of the Bible that's sort of stuck at the very beginning. And I can see that, I can understand that. I mentioned that, like, I also see it as, in Judaism, we go back to Abraham, right? We don't, when we talk about our patriarchs, we start with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, And we don't go back to Noah or Adam as Islam does, right? They include those two people in their line of prophets.
So does the Gospel of Matthew, by the way. It does include, in Jesus' lineage, goes all the way back to Adam.
Oh, so, I didn't know that. Good to know. But so Judaism doesn't see that, and, perhaps it's the universal versus particular, right? That Noah and Adam are everyone's ancestors, whereas Abraham is just that of the Abrahamic faiths and not necessarily everyone else. And so we're concerned with Abraham much more than we are Noah or Adam.
Yeah. Makes sense, I guess. Yeah. So that being said, the same weight that's put on this in Christianity isn't put on here. Do you look to this as sort of like a way that, like, as Augustine has coined, like, original sin, that this moment is when sin began?
No. This is, so far I've said, Ruth isn't as important to us, and this section isn't as important to us.
This is fascinating. This is good to talk about, right? Like, this is...
So, because we also put very different weight on sin, right, in Judaism than in Christianity. And so we are not trying to get back to a state of purity, or I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good
I would say
way to put it.
Naivete, though, really, for Adam and Eve, right? I think they're more naive than anything. The idea that sin is there, we just don't put as much weight on it, and so it's not something that we're trying to make up for. When we talk about sins, I don't like that word. I like the word transgression much more than sin, because I think that when we look at the laws that God gives us in the Torah, they're really meant as a guide, right? Like, how do you live a life that creates a relationship to community, to God, that helps guide you on the right path? Mm-hmm. When you stray from that path, when you do something that is against the Word of God, I see it as like a transgression, right? You're going against that. Is it good or bad? Some of them are definitely bad, right? Like murdering is bad. At the same time, I keep kosher. There's certain dietary restrictions that I keep, such as not eating meat and dairy together, right? Does eating a cheeseburger really, is it a sin? I don't know that I could put that much weight on it, right? It's a transgression, right? God, for very specific reasons, said, don't eat meat and milk together, and it leads you to live a holier life. If I eat it together, I don't, but if I were to eat it together, I'm transgressing that, and I have to make up to get back on the right path. But I don't know that I could go as far as to say, like, it's an evil thing. It's just not the right path for my theological outlook, for my relationship with God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always talk about, and this is sort of like my own personal understanding, right, of sin, is anything that we do that that hurts ourselves or others and is then damaging to our relationship with God.
Yeah, yes. So I think it's similar, and we're just it's the word choice almost, because I would agree.
Well, that and again, so like different versions of flavors of Christianity think very differently about sin, right? And there's some flavors of Christianity that really like to parse it out too, right? That there's almost a hierarchy of sins, and so if you're committed to sin on this level, right, like that's more irredeemable than a sin down here of putting cheese on your burger. You know what I'm saying? Like. So, and I don't know if, from a Lutheran theological perspective, we don't really believe that, nor do we, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of our theology and what we claim and how we believe in, quote, getting right with God, right? Like, it doesn't actually matter. We don't count sins in that way. And so, I don't remember where I was going down that tangent, but this idea of,
original sin, and
so,
where does it come from?
But technically, we do subscribe, in a traditional Lutheran theology, does subscribe to an original sin concept, because Martin Luther called it heretical sin. So this idea...
That's harsh.
Yeah, it is very harsh. That this idea that when these first two humans committed this act of transgression against God by, doing the thing they weren't supposed to do, going against the command. That this was where sin began, and then because they now were expelled from the garden, that they are now exposed to this knowledge of their sinful life, they are now responsible for their sins. And that every generation after, like through the act of being birthed, you are automatically birthed into that sin.
That's like Jewish guilt to the max. I mean, that is, so...
It's bad, right? Like, it's real bad, but...
But so I guess my question for you, right, and perhaps where maybe it's theology, maybe it's cultural, I don't know, right? In my mind, if we go back to sin... doesn't it need intention? Like, and that's why when I said, like, Adam and Eve are naive, right? Like, they don't know what they're doing is bad. And that's the whole idea of eating the fruit of tree of knowledge of good and evil is they don't know what they're doing. Well, so how can you do something bad if you don't know what you're doing is good or bad?
So this is how, so it can be parsed a few different ways. And this is, again, I want to be clear, this is not my theology, but this is how it gets theologically put out there, right? Like, one, like, they were given a command, don't do this. And so it didn't matter what their motivations were, they broke the command, okay? And then there's some people, so on one side, that it's Adam's fault, right? That Eve didn't know, right? That she was tricked, she was coerced, she didn't know. And she had already eaten it. And then she gives it to him. He knows and eats it anyways, along with her. Another perspective, and this is the one that, you sort of get the curse of Eve from, right, is that she's the one that made man fall. That all women are inherently, or have this curse of Eve, that they bring men down, right? That Tertullian called her the devil's gateway, or a mother of all demon offspring.
Well, to be honest, right, like, I can understand that. No, I'm not at all, right?
It's all women's fault. No, but Augustine takes it one step further. So Augustine actually doesn't believe that a woman can have salvation on her own. The only way for her to receive God's salvation is through her husband in marriage.
It's I don't like it.
Terrible theology, but like that was his perspective.
I don't ascribe to that, so it's but I would have a lot of problems with that. Just going back to the sequence of events, though, right? Eve doesn't tell Adam where the fruit comes from. She just gives him, right? She made him dinner, and she said, "Here, sweetie, eat this," and he ate it. So he didn't know I'm just trying to digest like everything that.
I'm sorry, I didn't like the Christian theology is not awesome. I agree with that. So
But how can? But again, I guess I still go back to like. So if we're looking at the evolution of humanity in the Bible, right? Very much Adam and Eve, the first two people on this planet, right, in this world, they know nothing. Right, you have a young child. I've got young children. Right, like I tell them not to do a lot of things, and they flat out ignore me. Right, their favorite word is no, and then they go and they do it anyways. But they're not listening to me. But they're not disobeying me. Right, like I wouldn't the way that if I were to tell my parents absolutely not, I'm not listening to you. Like there's much more intention and thought and purpose behind me saying no at my age to my parents than my 3-year-olds saying no to me now because like they
don't understand the weight and the gravity. You're right of what's happening or what it is.
Right, and they don't understand the consequences. Right, they don't understand that if they. One of them was spinning around with a laundry basket on his head yesterday, right? He did not understand when
example.
When I told him to stop because he was going to get dizzy, fall over, hit his head, and then cry. He didn't understand that sequence of events, and then it happened, right? Like, I still comforted him because, like, he is 3 years old and he's crying. But, like, that's how I see Adam and Eve, right? Is God says don't, but again, they have no concept of don't, right? Like, the punishment, if we go back, the punishment for eating the fruit is that they will die the day that they eat of the fruit, right? First, they don't die, right? Like, So I don't know if God had a change of heart. But they have no concept of death. They're the only two people. They were created from the ground and from a rib. Punishing them with death is like, it's punishing them for something that they have no concept of. Yeah. It's like, again, it goes back to like me telling my kids that I'm not going to, take them out to a restaurant. We never take them out to restaurants, right? But like to not do something with them that they have no idea what that means. That's what God's punishing them with.
Yeah, I mean, like that just makes sense. When you have 4 small children, you don't go to public spaces.
You don't go to public spaces. It's never good at a restaurant. We've been to a diner like twice, and it never ends well.
So I was telling Rabbi this before we started, because I also agree that I don't think it's fair to put the entire weight of the sins of the world on this moment or on these two naive people. And part of it's so I got in trouble for saying this in seminary, is that like this whole thing is God's fault, right? Like think about it, like God created the garden, God created the humans and created them with this sense of, I think FOMO,
wonder,
right?
Like, wonder, right?
Curiosity, whatever. And then God also created the serpent to test them. God put the tree there. If you didn't like
temptation, right?
Yeah, like if you didn't want them to do it, why did you put the tree there? Why did you do it?
What was the purpose of creating this tree or the tree of life, right? Like, there's the tree of life also, which gets lost in the story because they choose not to eat that from that tree. But why would God put temptation there?
Yeah.
If you don't want it, don't put it there.
So, something I want to dive into too is to talk about then again how Christianity takes this is that this serpent is indeed like the devil or Satan, right? That it is the embodied anti whatever. The Genesis 3 story actually doesn't mention Satan, the devil, at all, or the word sin or transgression or rebellion or guilt. None of those things. Those are things that we kind of like put onto the story in our own lens, which again, like we do that often when we interpret and things like that. But if you take that out, right, like if you take out this idea, right, that you don't have this, that it's not Satan in the garden, because it's a little bit different story if you understand that, like, well, God did indeed create this creature to tempt them.
So can we talk about the serpent for one moment? Before we even try to talk about like the devil or Satan or anything like that, I want to point out that in the entirety of the Bible, right, of the Hebrew Bible, of the Torah, there are very few animals that can speak, right? And when you ask me like the theology of like where does this fall into theology and all that, the snake is speaking, right? It's using language. Whatever language, Aramaic, Hebrew, whatever they're speaking, they can converse with the snake. They can't converse with any other animal that's in the garden. And we don't ever learn about the snake losing language, right? He has to writhe on his belly and nip at their heels, but God never removes the power of speech from the snake. So just in talking about is this the literal word of God? Is this a myth? Is this human understanding? Yeah. The other animals that are able to speak in the Torah, right? And I'm thinking of like Balaam's donkey, right? But that's an angel, right? Like that, God very specifically says like it's an angel's voice speaking through the donkey. It's not the actual donkey that is speaking. This snake seems to be speaking of his own free will or his own power, with his own intention again, right, and his own thought. It's not God speaking through the snake. So I just wanted to like point that out of like what role, like where does this story fall in our understanding is like why is this snake even speaking to start with? Like it doesn't make sense. And then we get to the part that you're talking about of how do we understand the snake and very much yes we read a lot of the intention onto the snake.
The idea of the snake here, the serpent that. My understanding, like in this story, that it is meant to be a literary character for us to be able to have this setup of how we got to where, again, if we're like talking that we needed some sort of
external force,
to like cause this situation to happen, and so it's purely it's meant to be a literary device, but also then to explain like why we hate snakes and like why, I don't know, like things like that too. And that talking animals were frequent literary devices in other ancient texts, like the concept, like I think it's the Greek writer of like Aesop started kind of like where that kind of tradition came from, but that other sort of personified animal thing did show up in other places.
In other places and cultures, right? But again, talking about how this story was created, right? That it's other cultures being brought in because we don't have other animals that talk like this in the Torah.
Which also, to me, it's one of those things that's indicative that like it could be a little bit later of a story, right? Because you had those external forces that were influencing the literature.
Right. Yeah.
Anyways, but this idea of this sort of the Satan, which for the record, even in Christianity is a later concept of this, like, of the actual devil. That's not, and I think that's influenced, I think it's mostly influenced, by the Greco-Roman, by like Hades and stuff, is where we start to kind of interpret that on the lens. But would you like to talk about the Satan?
So there is the concept of Satan in the Bible. We reference it. It's in our liturgy.
Is it more than just in Job?
Is it in more than just Job? I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I would have to look. I know that in our daily liturgy there's at least one reference to Satan in it, but we're not talking about Satan, right? Even though the Hebrew word, clearly the English word derives from the Hebrew word, we're not talking about
It's anglicized.
We're not talking about the horned, hoofed, red character with a pitchfork and all that. We're talking, it would translate in English to like the adversary. But in that sense, it's not it's any adversary, right? Like I could have a human adversary, and they would be the Satan. The same is true for the word Mashiach, right? Messiah, right? In Hebrew really means the anointed one, right? So all of our kings were Mashiach, were anointed with oil, right? David, Solomon, Solomon's children, right? Who became kings and killed each other and became kings and all that. Those issues. But all of them were anointed. And so it's not, when we talk about Messiah versus Mashiach, like the anointed one, we see that a bunch. Same with Satan. It's just an adversary. Yeah. It's not we see our adversaries maybe as evil, but it's not Satan, like the opposite of God. If God is good, then the Satan is evil.
One of the fallen angels, right. The children of heaven.
Right. We don't have that in Judaism, right? Yeah. For us, well,
again, it's the same thing with Christianity. Like, it is technically an outside influence that has permeated to kind of create this biblical character.
Really? I need to read my New Testament more. It's
do you have a copy around here somewhere?
I do actually. I try to keep all my religious books.
I also have a copy of my Hebrew Bible in Hebrew in my office, right next to my Hebrew grammar book, because those have to go together.
Those are over there. Yeah. We're recording in my office at the synagogue. If you didn't pick up on that, to the listeners, but I do. I have a Quran. I've got a couple of the New Testaments. I've got a Book of Mormon, and I have a book which I know Pastor Eric has talked about, I'm sure with your congregation, is the Jewish Annotated New Testament by Amy Jill Levine, which is just fabulous. It's just fabulous. Yeah. All that is to say, in Judaism, when we talk about evil, right, or bad things, we still see it all as coming from God, right? We don't understand why God does what God does. That's not up for us to humans to understand God's plan. What we don't have in Judaism is this sense that when bad things happen, it's because of some evil force that is outside of God. Because we do believe that God is all-powerful. And if that locus of evil is somewhere outside of God, that means that God can react to it, but God can't control it or determine it.
Yeah, right. So is this God's fault? Is God all powerful, or is there an outside force?
Right. And the all powerful, and so we have these different names for God in Judaism. Most of them are found in the Torah when God is describing characteristics, right? There's Elkanah, a jealous God. God calls God's self merciful and vindictive at times, and we see God's nostrils flare, right? I love that that description of when God gets angry, right? As though God has a nose for it to flare.
Yeah.
But we see God get angry and vindictive, and take God's anger out on people, whether it's the Israelites at time with plagues, or with the Egyptians with plagues. God really likes plagues. But we see God doing things that we wouldn't say are good things.
Yeah.
Thankfully, there's always sort of like a
just
makeup period.
That's really hard for Christians to reconcile.
Because we like to see God as all good and all loving.
Yeah.
Right. If we were going like real traditional Judaism, I'd say like that's part of God's love, right? Like that punishment, because it brings us back to relationship with God, right? It brings us back that path that I was talking about, right? Like when we transgress in the Torah, right, we're punished, and that brings us back into the fold. That's one outlook, right? I don't know. Again, I don't know that that's my outlook always.
Yeah.
Because I do like to think of God as loving and kind, and that we don't always need the stick to return to the right path.
Well, so I'm actually going to say, so kind of like talk about this idea here of a quote fall or whatever, and kind of creating that, if you do want to look in that mindset that these are the first transgressions or whatever. Something that I struggle with it in my own theology, right, is this idea, because again, like, if God set up this whole situation, if this is indeed like God created the system, God created the problem, so then God also has the solution. And so if this idea of creating the problem in order to drive us back to God, to me, that's a narcissistic God.
Yes. And
so I struggle with that, right? Like, I don't want to look at God in that lens, and that's like super hard of like, but like there's another way, right, of like, I don't know, like, so Luther just believes everyone's horrible all the time, that we're all just terrible worms, as he would call us. So this idea that like we need God to drive us, to create ways to drive us back to God, which is kind of like what you're saying too. But to me, it still like comes down to like, well, God created the problem.
God created the problem. Going back to the narcissistic God for a moment, though, right? Like, but God does need humanity, right? Like, that's, I think, one of the...
God does? Tell me.
So,
okay.
Well, but it's exactly like you're saying, right? Like, and we would say, right, God chooses the Israelite people to be God's people, and because God keeps giving us more opportunities to right our ways and to observe the commandments and to have that relationship, God doesn't give up on us. And so God needs humanity, right? Any right, if we step back here for a moment from our religion, right? Any deity needs people to believe in them, or else they're not a deity, right?
Well, that's true.
If you don't have followers, you can't be a god to anyone, right? If you can't be a king if you don't have subjects.
That's fair. Yeah.
And so God does need the Israelites, and at this point in the Bible, God needs humanity, because without them, God is nothing. So, in part, yes, I think God does create humanity in order to be listened to or worshipped or, followed, or however we want to phrase it at this point.
I'm just trying to find a way of like, yes, I agree, and like, is there a way that I can frame this so it's less narcissistic of God to say I needed to create these people so that they would worship me?
Well, he gave us sort of free choice, I guess. So that's
Well, I mean, I like this mindset.
We were given the ability to not worship God. It's just the wrong way to go.
I mean, I'm just thinking like relationship, right? Like what, is God's creative power that both is gifted to us to be like co-creators with God. As is there just like a gift in that relationship, right? Was God lonely? I don't know.
God had the angels, though. So why weren't the angels enough then, right? We can ask that because we know when God goes to create humanity in Genesis 1, right, God turns to them and says, let us create man in our image. Also, that's actually a really controversial challenge.
Supported by the Psalms. One of my favorite Psalms is
really
God's 82. God stands up in the divine assembly.
Yes, but that God says our image, right? That God uses the plural in the Hebrew when God is supposed to be singular. It's a.
But it's because in that phrase, God is speaking to the divine assembly.
Correct, right? Yeah. You're right.
I personally also like it because in my own personal theology, God is not necessarily gendered or is not a male. But I also wouldn't say like a female. If anything, the fact that we are all created in God's image to say that God actually encompasses all genders.
Yeah.
Because people are born male, they're born female, they're born intersex, they're born other things, right? Like that it's not only is it not binary, but it's more than just one thing to say that God is then a man. Now I understand why linguistically most of the time, right, it comes out, we get that the pronouns and with the patriarchal system, of course God couldn't be a woman, right? Like,
well, Hebrew is also a gendered language, right?
Exactly.
When we're looking at the Hebrew, it's a gendered language,
right?
And so it defaults to male, and so that's where you.
But this idea that God created them in our image, to me, that actually is beautiful. Of saying it's one of the places that I look to like this sort of gender expansive inclusiveness of God. So I usually, I use male pronouns for Jesus, female pronouns for the Spirit, and they them pronouns for God.
So I'll give you
in spaces that I can be in that will allow that.
I'll give you a midrash that you'll love because when in Genesis 1 when people are created, it's different than in Genesis 2, right? Genesis 2 is when you get man created from ground and woman created from the rib. In Genesis 1, it says male and female, God created them, right? And there's this whole midrash, this rabbinic tale, that it's actually one being that's like back to back, that's both male and female, and then at some point God sort of divides them down the back to separate the two of them. But that first being, dirtling, like you said, but this is before the dirtling, right? That the first being is actually male and female together, and God goes and separates them, because in chapter 1 it's really all separation creation, right? God separates night from day, darkness from light, and so the rabbis follow suit and say, well, God must have created one being that was male and female and then separated them, but initially they're created as a single entity, a single being.
Yeah. I love this. That's what all these books on the shelves.
That's what all these books on the shelves teach us, yes.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I don't know. I just really like this. It's really affirming to me to think that I was like, oh man, we have nice Old Testament theology. So one
back
of the
to evil,
things,
though. Back to evil.
Well, so the thing when where Augustine really parses this out and where Martin Luther kind of follows after him in this idea of this, quote, original sin or the fall or where the origin of sin comes from the book of Romans. So Paul writes, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin, and so death spread to all because all have sinned. This is that letter from Paul is then where it's then related back to that, which is also something that I struggle with sometimes, because it's the same thing where we then we superimpose sort of other theology back onto the ancient texts that's not what it have meant in that place and time. It's the same thing where, like, in a lot of the places where you're talking about the Anointed One, almost always everyone says, well, that was about Jesus. They were writing about Jesus, right? Which is not true. And when we then, superimpose Jesus into places that wouldn't have been understood that way, to whom it was written, when it was written, who was writing it, like the meaning of what they were getting at is what's important. And so that's also how I feel about this story, right? That, like, is that how it would have been understood? And you're here telling me no.
No, I don't think it wouldn't have been understood as the devil, right? Is the snake, slimy, right? Like all the characteristics, right? Like the nachash, the serpent was chosen intentionally for the animal, right? It wasn't a butterfly, right? It wasn't something.
The butterfly said go eat.
Right?
Very different story.
Very different story, right? The creature is chosen intentionally, and certainly what happens. But like you said, I think it's more of this literary device to move humanity forward than it is about people falling into sin and the influence of the devil and evil. Life would have been boring if we had stayed in the garden, right? Like if we had stayed in the Garden of Eden and everything had been given to us, and we just had all this, food all around and talking to animals, like it would have been a pretty, I hate to say it and all that, but like that would have been a really boring existence as opposed to what we have, in the world today, which isn't always great, but it can be exciting.
And again, so when you look at it with this lens of when it was written, right, was to explain the answer to some questions, right? Like what happened to us? How did we get here? Why do we do things? Why do we hate snakes? Why do we whatever, right? Like if we understand it of sort of like looking back to explain our humanity, it makes a lot more sense. It also makes a different set of sense in saying like, well, this is where humanity all went to shit with the first two people, right? If we're saying sort of something of, we do have this loving relationship with God, and God wants us to be well, and God wants us to be whole, and God wants us to, to thrive. And there are forces in this world, and we're explaining it from our experiences, right? There are forces in this world. There are things that happen that there's suffering. There's people make bad decisions. People, whatever. Right. Like, so how do we explain the existence of our world in relationship to God?
Right.
Right.
And so, you need what happens in Genesis 3 in order to explain that, because if not, then we're still sitting in the garden.
Yeah.
So,
which again, still Augustine would just say that's original sin. You just described it, so there you go. But
yeah, but no. It's.
I actually wrote a paper in seminary that the original sin of humanity is patriarchy, and that's actually where it.
How did that go over?
Really well with a particular professor. Yeah. Don't worry. I went to a fairly liberal seminary. I was like, it's in Pennsylvania, it's across a little bit of both. But anyways, with this particular professor, but also, like, if you make a good argument, like, and you can justify it with theology, which again, you can with a lot of things, but the idea of, like, this setup and how we have understood things like this, and Augustine's teachings of stuff, of how that's kind of set up the misogyny within our system and within our religious culture, within our societal cultures, and that system in itself actually is what stems, is the stem and driving force of colonialism. It's the stem and driving force of capitalism, and the ways in which those damage the earth and its people. Anyways, just saying.
Wow.
Just saying. Because it's drawing on this idea, too, about, again, so we talk about Christians have a larger emphasis on this sin thing, is we have different kinds of sins. And so we have, like, the theologian Daniel Miglioria would say that there are natural evils and moral evils. That natural evils, if they're even evils at all, are the things that happen at the hands of nature, right? Like the circle of life. The lion eats the wildebeest, right? That's death, that's murder, but that's part of... Does that make sense? And then
I don't agree with it, but yes, I can understand
but that's the idea of sort of like it's a natural evil. Again, I don't classify that as evil either. I don't either. Right. And then there's moral evil, and that's the evil that we commit against ourselves, against others, against God at the hands of humans. And then that can be broken into like individual and structural sins, because there are things in our world that, like, whether we know that we do them or a part of systems, we're a part of systems that are inherently sinful and are harming people. And so this idea of, we talk about this a lot with New Testament stuff, because this idea about, like, what are we confessing or repenting for, or what are we being saved from, right? That, like, we can't actually, and the idea that, like, some Christians are, like, trying to, be as pure as they possibly can to, like, do, like, that because of these systems, like, that's not a thing, right? That we can't actually, no matter what we do. I don't care how good you think you are.
You're part of something larger.
Yeah, and so, like, if you understand then our relationship with God, with the world around us and stuff, in a system that like is not perfect and it has all of these flaws, then where is that relationship with God? Then what might God's expectations of us be? Does that make sense?
It does. Judaism, I think, keeps it a little bit smaller, right? We keep it about the individual, and we recognize that sometimes our actions have unintended consequences, but when we, I'm thinking of like Yom Kippur, like our Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the year for us, like when we make our confession on that day, we apologize for things that we know we did and things that we don't know that we did, which is maybe the closest that we come to that idea of systems. But again, for us, it needs to have intention behind it, right? So if I buy something from a company and that company uses a subcontractor that does child labor in another part of the world, I don't know that Judaism holds me responsible for endorsing child labor, because how could I have known that the tertiary or fourth, fifth party that was being subcontracted, Judaism sort of says, don't worry, like, you did your best. Yeah, you unknowingly contributed to it, but it's not again, that word sin, right? Like, it's not a sin. It's aggressive, because there was no intention behind what you did. And we see it...
we would say in Christianity, the instant that you know...
Right. Once you know, it becomes, if you know and you keep on doing it, that's a problem. But if you didn't know, it's a different tier of transgression than if you know, right? There has to be, but it's the same way with our good deeds, right? Like, just doing a good deed for the sake, whatever, that isn't as purposeful or meaningful as doing it intentionally, right? Because you're commanded to do it, that carries more weight because there's thought and purpose behind it. And so it's not just with sin or transgression that we're talking, but it's those good deeds too, right? Just helping an old lady cross the street. That's really nice, right? That's not a commandment. That's not a mitzvah, we would call it in Judaism, because you were crossing the street anyways.
So again, I can say this for my theology, and what I would say is indicative of much of my colleagues in at least in Lutheran understandings too, about like what we would talk about, like, doing the good things, or as we call them, works or fruits of the Spirit, as some would say, that we do them out of a place of generosity, not because they're commandments, but because... Well, we say because of Jesus, right? That like Jesus said, "Love God, love your neighbor," and that's what you're to do. So I guess kind of as a commandment from Jesus, but the place that it comes from is out of gratitude for the gift rather than earning something, if that makes sense. So we're not earning any points with God by doing the good deeds. God always comes to us with all of the points, right? But because of that amazing gift, we do these things in gratitude and to share the gifts of God with others.
It's a beautiful outlook. Like, I won't deny that that's a beautiful outlook, right? I think that is.
Like part of the good deeds isn't necessarily like, just do nice things for people or whatever. But it's making the world a more equitable place for all. And so it's not this idea of sort of, Martin Luther King Jr., right? That like peace isn't the the absence of war, but the presence of justice, right? And so that's indeed what we are striving for.
Right. So again, I would walk back one thing that you said, which is that it's not me doing those mitzvot, the commandments, isn't about earning God's love, right? God is also in those names for God. God is also a loving God. Following the path that God has set, doing those commandments, is for me, right? Is whether we can use Christian terminology as a sinful being, right? As someone who has both forces pulling at me, right? The Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and the Yetzer HaTov, the good inclination. Like those two forces. I'm pointing to my shoulders. There's like the little angels sitting on it.
Like people can't
right? Like we have those two forces pulling on us, and the mitzvot, the commandments from the Torah, help me continuously choose the right path, the good path, and stay away from the bad.
Yeah.
It's not so much that if I do it, God will love me more than someone else. It's that I will be a better person.
I would say 100% Lutheran theology agrees with you in that aspect of like how we also view the law too, right? That it's not that God's going to love you less or anything like that, but that it helps your relationship. So I agree.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Martin Luther has
theology.
a phrase. He says that we are all simultaneously saint and sinner.
I like it.
It being in that middle of
duality.
That space, right?
It's that duality.
That,
yeah,
it really is. But the idea that like each and every person has the capacity for incredible love. We also have the incredible capacity for destruction.
Yeah.
And that's like innately, I think, what it means to be human, right? And so, that actually to me still brings us back to this story, right? And this idea of like, how did God create these humans, right? Were they were created with all these capacities still?
So they were created with all these capacities, but maybe that's where this story becomes so important. And even if we go with Augustine's original sin, right? Like, no, but to reread it, right, that it's not actually a sin, but it's actually a blessing. Because if we have those capacities, as Luther said, that we are within us, because that means that these two people were created with those capacities.
Yeah.
Because God created you and me and these two people sitting here, that if all those capacities are innately within us, they didn't have the knowledge of what it meant to choose either of those capacities. Cain could have killed Abel, and I mean, even that is a naive thing, and Cain still doesn't understand death when he kills Abel, right? But any of those actions are done without knowledge, without understanding, and the eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil begins to give us that capacity to understand what these forces in the world mean. And, does Christianity want to say, well, one force didn't exist in the world until Eve ate of the fruit? I can't believe that, because if God created the world in the 2 chapters before this story, then all those elements had to already exist in the world.
Yeah.
And Eve just brought it into our capacity to understand it as human beings, so that when we make the good choices, we understand we've made the good choices. And when we make the bad choices, we understand the bad choices. So she gave us, we'd say it da'at, really, is knowledge.
And that's where sin comes from, because you have the ability to understand
your choices, right?
He uses the Latin phrase, which again Luther really liked this, because Luther's we're all horrible people, right? So like that's this phrase that Augustine coins or talks about as concupiscence, which is a Latin phrase that it means like lust. It can mean sexual lust, but it could just mean like lusting after anything. So like there's sin here of like, I called it like FOMO instead, or like curiosity, but their lust to know that, like, need to eat the fruit even though they're not supposed to, right? That's what the sin is. But they don't have. So I guess so then how does he see the serpent? Because they don't, right? Like if the serpent didn't exist, I would agree with him 100%. Yeah. But the serpent exists. I agree with you. I mean, that's the whole thing is like, it's not. How can you blame these two naive people and not understanding, right? When there's indeed this outside force that's like taunting, is tricking them, is coercing them, is manipulating them. But even that outside force, talking about like reading our understanding of it back on, is the Nachash doing that, or is the Nachash simply saying like God is hiding something from you, right? Like, you need to know that there's more to this life than what's inside this garden wall. So maybe the Nachash, maybe the serpent isn't the devil. Maybe it's truth. Ooh. Yeah. Ooh. Yeah, that there's not necessarily, doesn't need to be a negative connotation with this creature. No, right? Like, did the creature alter the course of biblical and human history if we're reading this literally? Yes, absolutely. But at the same time, this creature was honest, right? Was said that there's more to life
then this garden and what God has shown you, if you eat from that, you're not going to die, right? That's, that's a punishment that was told to you that isn't really,
well, that also,
you
bring that up, right? Like, this is, again, this is my argument again with it being God's fault. God lied to them.
God lies, absolutely. It's, again, if we go back to, like, the parent thing, right? It's like when you threaten your child with a punishment that you have no intention of keeping. All right, you're not going to be allowed to watch TV if you don't do X. No, I'm going to give them screen time, because if they have screen time, they're not bothering me while I'm trying to do everything else. But yet, God lied here, right? God said, you're going to die, and then they didn't die that day.
Yeah. This is... I love in talking about some of these things because, again, I really struggle with this version of Christianity of sort of like the real, like, literal fundamentalism. And, like, some of the biblical stances that they take, like, they don't make sense and they don't hold up. Like, at the instant you say, well, like, God lied to them, right? Like, oh, well, that pushes back about everything that you were just saying. And it was... and so, like, to me, like, it's really important to talk about those things. And, like, it again, this is why we have the podcast, right? Like, it is uncomfortable, and, like, it can push us in weird ways to talk about, like, is God lying? Like, or, like, what did God do? Or, like, God always manipulating them? Or, like, what?
Well, so I'd say, does God always have to be the good guy in the story? Yeah. And I think that sometimes the answer is no, God doesn't always have to be the good guy. But that's coming from the Jewish perspective, where I say that God is all, right? Like, God is good and bad and loving and vindictive and all those things wrapped into a single entity, a single being, or God's not even a being, right? Into a single God. That God has all those capacities, and so I don't need to read every story as God is the good guy. Sometimes God is morally morally amoral about what's happening. Not as much as, like, the Greek and Roman gods, right? Like Zeus sitting on Mount Olympus. Like, God still has love and care for humanity. Yeah. But there are times where we don't understand why God is doing what God is doing, and it's not to our immediate benefit.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think so I think, like, in theory, Christians do agree with that, right? That, like, God is omniscient, all the things, all powerful, is whatever. But really struggle with, well, what that means is, does God indeed cause pain? Does God, like, for instance, in the story of Jericho, like, kind of justify some, a lot of death, some genocide there, right? Like, so, like, what, war with the Philistines, things like that, right? Like, there are a lot of things that, like, aren't pretty or violent, and how do we, and this, I don't necessarily have, like, a great answer, and this, I think every person has to go through this for themselves. How do you reconcile this with your relationship and your understanding of who God is?
Yeah, there's a great Venn diagram, and where it's coming from right now, I'm blanking on, right? But that God, we want to ascribe three things to God. That God is omniscient, all-knowing, God is omnipotent, is all-powerful, and that God is all-good. And the Venn diagram says that God can't be all three things at once. Yeah. Right? That God can only be two of those, and that might be limiting God's power. But Judaism would say that God doesn't have to be all good at all, right? That God is all-knowing and all-powerful, not necessarily all good all the time, even though we know that God is loving and all that, but God can't be all three at the same time, because then what do you do with evil?
I'm just going to quote God from the book of Job. Who are you to try to tell me?
Right. To put limit on God's power is who am I? That's Jean Valjean, though. So, I don't know. This is a tough one, I think, to try to reconcile or, like, have a good way of thinking about it, right? Because you do have to take both with that. Like, if you're really looking at it, either God isn't all powerful or God manipulated this situation, and if so, why, and what does that tell us? And for all we know, right, if we want to spin it in a positive way, for all we know, God did manipulate this situation, and what happened was exactly what God wanted, which is why He doesn't kill Adam and Eve, or the Nachash or the serpent, right? Why none of them die is because this is the start of civilization and humanity in its true flourishing state, not sitting in the garden, but that they get to go out into the world and bring good things into the world. Maybe that's exactly what God wanted. God just needed them to get there on their own.
Do you know anything about like when it, like again with the toddler, like if you want them to do something, you like don't tell them to do it. You tell them not to do something, right? And then they're going to do it.
Right.
Another parenting tactic over there. Yeah.
Could be that as well.
Or like you say, like, right, like trying to get my child to eat vegetables. I tell her you can't have carrots. Well, all she's going to want now is carrots. Maybe.
You have to come over and tell my kids that, because I can't get them to eat a carrot for anything. But yes, right, and they needed that little extra push. So the speaking Nachash, the speaking serpent, is there, and then disappears because we don't need a talking animal after this. Although we're going to get another language story in the very next set of chapters when we get to right after Noah with the Tower of Babel and the mixing up of the world's languages. Right, language is going to come into play again.
We've talked about that before too. We actually talked about that recently when we were talking about Pentecost sort of being in Christianity the anti-Tower of Babel.
You'll have to explain how later.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah. So I just have one more question. Does there any like school of Judaism thoughts that kind of, pins us all on Eve, or like it points to this as the inferiority of women, or that women are the ones that actually cause sin, or any of that crap that I talked about that Tertullian was saying?
No. It really is when we talk about the non-egalitarian movements in Judaism, and even the patriarchal setup of Judaism, Eve doesn't play a part in it. It does play more into, traditional patriarchal roles that humanity played in these ancient times of the men being out the hunters, the gatherers, the shepherds, and the women being the stay-at-home housewives and moms. And later in tradition, in religion even, it has to do with like who controls your time, right? That men control their own time, whereas women, because they're staying at home with the children, their time is controlled by the children or by others, and so they are not bound by the same obligations as men because they don't control their own. It sounds bad to say they don't control their own lives, but like there's other factors at play, that responsibilities that they have that men don't have in that non-egalitarian patriarchal system. My own movement has said that doesn't really work anymore, right? That all parents contribute to the household, and all parents or people contribute to finances and those other responsibilities. And while there might still be pay gaps and glass ceilings, for the most part, everything is open to everyone.
You don't agree with Harrison Bucker?
No, I don't necessarily. He has the right to say whatever he wants to say, right? No, but he has the right to say whatever he wants to say. Do I think he was smart to say it? No. Do I agree with it?
I mean, I don't care. No. Just do I agree with him? Nope, sure don't. Thanks.
No.
Yep.
But all this is to say in a very confusing way is that no, we don't pin any of what happens to humanity in the subsequent chapters of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy. None of it falls back on Eve. That's the condition of what it is to be human.
Yeah, no one says, "Oh, you as a woman cannot be made right with God except through your husband's salvation."
No. Might be a really good ad for Judaism right here. I don't know,
No, I don't think so. And it's And there, I mean, like, there are, I want to be clear, there are still, like, again, so you have that wide swath, the spectrum of Christianity, too, and so, like, that understanding. And as we live in the South, because neither of us are Southerners, you get I think, for me, a broader breadth, actually, of what that spectrum of Christian theology is here. I would say more tainted to one side, right? But, like, that we are having these kind of conversations, like, puts it, I just keep moving my arms, like, you're going to understand what I'm saying. And that just, that we have, that there is still room for all of that.
That's great. In Judaism, because we have because we have the denominations, that's the spread of what we believe and how we approach theology and biblical texts and all that is fairly self-contained. No matter where you go, some will always be more liberal or more conservative in how they take the word of God and where they fall on the denominational spectrum, even within movements. Mm-hmm. But I don't, being from the North and now being in the South, I don't see that much different theologically between the North and Southern.
Yeah, they're very different in
very different culturally. So culturally, all the other things very differently. Like theologically, not so much.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining us on this, and the folks at Emmanuel. Like, thank you so much for listening to this Christian podcast, and it's beautiful for us to move across these dividing lines, right? To be able to say that we both agree and love in the same God, and how these things influence us and our relationships with one another is incredibly beautiful. I'm very interested in Pastor Eric's take on this because he does like original sin, and so we'll see what he has to say for folks at St. Matthew's.
We'll have to have a couple beers and then we'll get into it.
But for everyone else, just thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you.
As always, you can learn more about this podcast at the 10footpollepodcast.com and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at 10footpole Podcasts. And that we are here if you want to ask questions or engage in conversation about any of the topics. We'd love to chat with you. So thanks again, Rabbi.
Thank you for having me, and I hope to come back at some point because this was just fantastic.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.